they're kind of peculiar, you know. They're people who are visionary as part of their temperament. And we know that visionariness, so to speak, is an element of temperament. It's associated with trait openness, and that's associated partly with intelligence, but also partly with creativity, and those things aren't exactly the same. So some people are more imaginative and visionary than others, and in our culture those would be people who tell great stories, like J.K. Rowling is a really good example of that. She's been a shamanic intermediary for an entire generation of young people with these massive books that she's written that have a mythological core right down to their essence. And Stan Lee, who ran Marvel Comics, is another person like that, who's had an immense cultural influence because he's brought these ancient stories back up from the depths and put them into modern form. And the writers of these things are quite consciously aware of what they're doing with regards to the relationship with the underlying myths. They're not stupid people. And even if they were, their readership rapidly informs them if they're deviating from the proper narrative arc of the story. Because all those superheroes have their dedicated cults of followers, and they make bloody sure that the new writers don't mess around with the story. And so not only is it top down from the writers, but it's also bottom up from the readers. So they're all participating in the construction of a continuing cultural apparatus. So spontaneous vocation, well, you're sort of designed for it. Hereditary transmission, well, it's a familial issue. And then there's the personal quest issue too. So that's sort of associated with spontaneous vocation. So, and the personal quest element would be, there's always people in every culture who are fundamentally obsessed with the pursuit of meaning. That's their essential orientation towards life. They're not particularly practical, like a conscientious person would be, because a conscientious person works, and their head isn't in the clouds. But there are types of people who are not like that at all. Their heads are in the clouds permanently, and they're extraordinarily imaginative and creative, and they're thought leaders in many ways for the culture, because a lot of what cultures learn in an articulated sense, a lot of what they become conscious of, is presented to them by artists in somewhat unconscious form long before the full meaning of what's being portrayed is articulated. Just like that, I just showed you that tree image with Mary and the church, on either side of it. It's not like the person who drew that knew what they were doing. They knew more about what they were doing than the people who couldn't draw that sort of thing. But they were existing on the edge of their knowledge, making this representation, thinking, I'm trying to get at something here. I'm trying to get at something here. But they didn't really know what it was, because the idea is so complex that, when people are coming up with it over these thousands of year periods, they don't realize the full import of what it is that they're revealing. Just as you don't realize your own full import. By whatever, this is from Mircea Eliade, but by whatever method he may have been designated, a shaman is recognized as such only after having received two methods of instruction. The first is ecstatic, dreams, trances, visions. The second is traditional, shamanic techniques, names and functions of the spirits, mythology and genealogy of the clan, and secret language. The twofold teaching imparted by the spirits in the old master shaman constitutes initiation. And so that's a very interesting representation of the manner in which personal revelation becomes knowledge. So let's say you're beset by a very frightful series of nightmares. What that's going to do is to drive you to try to understand how to represent what you're having nightmares about in terms of the cultural elements that you have at hand. Because that's what makes you sane, If you're having experiences that are beyond the norm, unless you can incorporate them back into your culture, you're alienated from your culture, and that's a terrifying thing. It means you might be the only person that's insane like you. And that's very intolerable for people. It's bad enough to be different, but to be so different that you're incomprehensible, it's like that's the sort of horror you don't want to encounter. So the shaman are people who are possessed by a rich inner fantasy life, but who are simultaneously capable of taking that and weaving it into the cultural mythology that they're part of. That's what makes them sane rather than insane, right? Because a schizophrenic is someone who has visionary experience, although it's often auditory. They hear voices and they're possessed by spirits in a sense. You can see them wandering down the street, muttering to their own internal voices, but they can't integrate any of that with the culture, and so they're gone, they're lost souls. So the shaman is someone who does both, who has the visions, but who incorporate it at the same time. So he's someone who's master of the visions and not victim of them. And so there's technologies that allow people to do that. And a lot of them are associated, as I said before, with the use of various hallucinogenic substances. In Siberia, the youth who is called to be a shaman attracts attention by his strange behavior. For example, he seeks solitude, becomes absent-minded, loves to roam in the woods or unfrequented places, has visions, and sings in his sleep. In some instances, this period of incubation is marked by quite serious symptoms. Among the Yakuts, the young man sometimes has fits of fury and easily loses consciousness, hides in the forest, feeds on the bark of trees, throws himself into water and fire, and cuts himself with knives. So those are ordeals in a sense, A future shaman among the Tungus, as they approach maturity, go through a hysterical or hysteroid crisis, but sometimes their vocation manifests itself at an earlier age. The boy runs away into the mountains and remains there for a week or more, feeding on animals, which he tears to pieces with his teeth. He returns to the village filthy and blood-stained, and it's only after 10 or more days have passed that he begins to babble incoherent words. So you'd think from the perspective of modern human beings, this is something like descent into the unconscious structures that underlie normative cognition, just like you descend into that at night when you dream. It's a very peculiar process that you're all perfectly capable of engaging in, but most of you have virtually no control over it. I mean, there are people who dream lucidly, and who can exert some conscious control over their dreams. Most people can learn how to do that to some degree, but in our culture at least, most people dream unconsciously, and it's just something that happens to you and not something that you're actively engaged with. The strange behavior of future shamans have not failed to attract the attention of scholars, and from the middle of the past century, by which he meant the 19th century, several attempts have been made to explain the phenomenon of shamanism as a mental disorder, but the problem was wrongly put. For on the one hand, it's not true that shamans always have to be neuropathics or neurotics or people who are not well put together mentally. On the other hand, those among them who had been ill became shaman precisely because they had succeeded in becoming cured. So what that means is these are people who've undergone some kind of existential crisis, sometimes one that's induced, as part of the process that turns them into shaman, but they were able to undergo that existential crisis and then put themselves back together. And so that's what makes them masters of the chaotic realm, so to speak. And so if you're starting to fall apart and you don't know what to do, well, the best thing you can possibly do is find someone who's been there and come back. And that idea of going somewhere and coming back is also a very, very common mythological story. So that's the story of the Hobbit, for example, right? The Hobbit goes off on this quest, and he undergoes all sorts of trials, and he encounters the dragon that lives underneath everything, and he gets the gold from the dragon, which is the information that the dragon stores. And then he comes back to his community, and he's transformed. But he's strange. Like, he's going off on this big adventure. Now he's like well put together and tough, and he's also rich. But he's also peculiar, When Bilbo goes back to the Shire, no one's exactly sure what to do with him because now he's contaminated with everything that he's gone through. So he's like an agent of chaos himself, and someone who's somewhat terrifying.